I got obsessed about platforms approximately 6 to 7 years back, and I stumbled into platforms by accident. I was actually, at that point in time, creating an investment thesis, and in the process of creating an investment thesis, I was trying to understand how a new breed of startups were different from the traditional internet startups that we'd seen in the past. Back in 2009, 2010, when we did not yet hear about Airbnb and Ubers, at that point when I talked to people about platforms, they did not understand what I was talking about. They just thought it was Web 2.0 because that was what the whole rage was at that point in time. But I believe that we were in the middle of a much more fundamental and transformative shift in business that was happening at that point in time. And this shift was what I wanted to specifically look at much deeper. So to differentiate between the idea of the platform versus what was not a platform, I came up with the original idea of pipes, which is that traditionally it's a metaphor for how we've always seen business. We've always seen business as a pipe where value is flowing from the producer down to the consumer, and you have a consumer at the other end of the pipe taking value back from the pipe. The way such a business works is that you just need to regulate the flow of value from the producer to the consumer. Think of traditional media like a television or the radio. It moves like a pipe. The content moves in one direction. Think of manufacturing. It moves like a pipe. All of traditional industrial models moved like a pipe. And this was the fundamental way in which traditional business models differed from the new business model that was emerging. It's not so much the use of technology, it's not so much the creation of ecosystems. What is fundamentally different about the new model of business is that the way business flows has completely changed. And because the flow of business has changed, the sources of power change, the way you make money changes, and the way you compete as a business completely changes. So the fundamental change that is happening in business today is a change in the very flow of business. In a world of pipes, we saw business move from a producer to a consumer in a straight line. What we're seeing today, increasingly, in a world of platforms, is a whole range of flows between different participants, and the business no longer controls the flow. It just enables the flow to happen between these different participants. And the factors that it creates to enable this exchange, to enable this multi-directional flow, is what makes this business so unique. There are a lot of ways to use today's exponential technologies and yet not be a platform if you do not have these networked multi-dimensional flows. So think of different ways in which you would think of companies. The traditional way in which the telecom industry worked was a pipe model. Even today, the telecom industry is called a dumb pipe. And the telecom industry, as well as the handset manufacturing industry, worked in a model where the producer created value and they pushed it out onto the market. Whereas if you look at the way Android works, Android owns neither the handsets nor the apps that are created on top of the handsets. First, it creates a flow between handset manufacturers and consumers, and then it creates another flow between app developers and consumers. And it internalizes all these flows onto one single platform. And that's why this is so transformative, because Android, the way it scales, the way it competes, is very different from the way a traditional handset manufacturer would have competed. We're seeing something similar happening with the taxi industry versus Uber. We're something similar happening with Airbnb versus the hotel industry, where one model used to work in the form of pipes. It would create inventory, lease it out, and make money on that inventory. The other model creates a network of participants which interact with each other constantly, and the platform enables that exchange. And we've seen that in the past with social media. We've seen that in the past with the likes of YouTube, the Amazon Kindle publishing platform. We've repeatedly seen a traditional linear model of business being replaced by or augmented by a more networked flow of business. And this is the fundamental shift that I believe is increasingly important in today's world. The idea that you can look at your business, model it as a series of linear flows, and ask yourself, what are the points in this business where I can change the linear flow to a networked flow? That is the opportunity of the platform that is there in almost every industry. And the reason this opportunity is so prescient at this point in time is because if you want to create networked flows in business, you need to have a way to identify the source and the destination of the flow, because you do not own these two things. In a pipe, you own the source and you sort of own the destination because you would have a connect with the retailer. In a platform, you need to know the source and the destination from which business is flowing, and that is where digital technologies play a role. Because thanks to digital, today everything can be digitized. Thanks to the mobile phone, a taxi can be digitized. 10 years back, a taxi could not be digitized, and so you could not have Uber 10 to 15 years back. Thanks to digital flows today, any object, anything at all can be digitized, and that's what we call the Internet of Things. And so we can have platform business models in manufacturing, in oil and gas, in mining, thanks to this Internet of Things. So the reason digital technology is so important is because they can digitize the source of production and the source of consumption, thereby tracking the flow end-to-end and internalizing that flow on the platform. And that's what's so remarkably powerful about the platform. If you think about the traditional way in which we used to hail a taxi, the interesting thing about Uber is not the fact that it aggregated taxis and passengers together, but the fact that it internalized the whole flow. The traditional way of hailing a taxi would be you would go out on the road, you would hold your hand up, a taxi would stop, you would get into the taxi, you would talk to the driver, he would drop you somewhere, and then he would move out. And none of that flow would be internalized. Today, that end-to-end flow is internalized. Your hand hailing becomes an action on the phone. After that, the taxi's arrival at your place, the taxi's start of the route, and the actual routing end-to-end gets tracked on Uber so that it then allows Uber a whole range of data which enables the payment facilitation as well as intelligence about connecting taxi drivers and users in the future. And so the factor that makes platform businesses so powerful is not just the ability to aggregate all of these producers and consumers and ecosystem together, but the ability to understand the interactions that are happening between these two different participants. In the past also, we had what we would think of as platform businesses. If you think of the Duomo Milan, the central area in front of the church in Milan, that's a platform because people would come there together, interact with each other, marketplaces would be set up over there. But the big difference is that the interactions would not be internalized. It was a dumb platform. It would just aggregate people, it would never learn from the interactions, and it would never be able to scale and replicate those interactions in the future. What's happening today is that in addition to digitization, centralized artificial intelligence is capturing all of this information about interactions and making the platform more intelligent over time. As a result of that, today's platforms benefit from something that is really unique. And that is the idea of the feedback loop, which is that the more a platform gets used, the more its usefulness increases for further users. If you think of any platform, there are multiple kinds of participants that participate on the platform. If you think of Airbnb, you have room providers and you have travelers. And the more you have participation on both sides, the more each side reinforces the other. The test of a platform business model is not in its ability to use technology. It's not in the number of users that are there. It's in the ability of the platform to benefit from feedback loops. It's possible to start a website or start an app and get millions of users and not even have a single feedback loop, and you won't have a platform. At the same time, it's possible to start something, have only a few users, and yet have a feedback loop that can enable you to scale from there to 1 billion users without having to use the traditional models of scale. And so very often, when people think about platforms, they think about millions of users, but the true test of a platform is in the existence of this feedback loop that scales the platform over time. Because of this feedback loop, all platforms benefit from network effects. Some network effects are positive, which is that the more producers and consumers on a platform, the more everybody benefits from each other's participation. And sometimes network effects are negative. For example, if you're a seller on eBay, and if there are too many other sellers selling the same thing, you get frustrated because your ability to price goes down. And so sometimes network effects start working in the negative direction as well. So what's really important is that if you're the producer or the consumer on a platform, it's important to understand what are the factors that enable positive network effects for you and that enable positive feedback loops for you on the platform to help you scale along with the platform. When I wrote my first book last year, I called it Platform Scale. because I was fascinated by this specific aspect about platforms. The fact that platforms can scale in a model that was not possible with traditional businesses, because you did not have the same kind of feedback loops in traditional business. Even if you had feedback loops on the supply side of the traditional business, they were not internalized and they did not scale in the same way. But platforms scale in a very new kind of fashion. That's why I named my first book Platform Scale, because I was so obsessed with it. But as I moved on from that book, I realized that there were many more aspects to the idea of platform business models that were transforming entire elements of the economy. And that's why when I wrote my second book, I called it Platform Revolution, which is that there's a fundamental and transformative shift that's happening in the nature of the market because of the way platform businesses work. There are several things that are happening and how market structures today are changing. The first is that a lot of traditional markets have had gatekeepers, and these gatekeepers have been very slow and unscalable. If you ever tried publishing a book through a publisher, through a traditional publisher, you realize how unscalable a traditional gatekeeper is. Today what we're seeing a whole new kind of gatekeeper coming in who's much more scalable and is hopefully much fairer. It's not always the case that the new gatekeepers are much fairer than the older ones, and I'll visit that shortly. But what's important is that in today's world, we're seeing these new forms of gatekeepers, these platforms, coming in, intermediating markets, but doing so in a very scalable fashion. If you think of how publishing used to work in the past, you had to know somebody in the publishing industry. You had to have a way in to get discovered by the market, because it was very difficult for this central gatekeeper to scale itself and to look at a lot of submissions in a scalable fashion. And what Amazon does to some extent is by creating an open Kindle publishing platform, it allows the market to help your book be discovered by anybody out there. And so in that way, Amazon has ended up creating a much more scalable form of gatekeeping for the publishing industry. The second thing that platforms do in terms of how they impact markets is that they unlock spare capacity. The concept of spare capacity is very interesting because fundamentally, traditionally in the industrial model, whenever a flow of business was restructured, people always thought that there was no new value creation. It was just a restructuring of value. Somebody else was coming into the business and taking away some value, and it was a zero-sum game where value was being redistributed. But what we see today is that a lot of spare capacity is being unlocked. Nobody in the past thought that the empty room at home could be used as a B&B. Nobody thought that the time that you were spending watching television could instead be used creating video and putting it up on YouTube. So essentially, a whole lot of spare capacity has been unlocked, and that was possible because what platforms do is they allow equal access to the market to anybody out there. And I would use that term equal with quotes around it, because there are some new mechanisms which determine what factors will determine your access to the market. But what platforms do is that they allow these mechanisms to permeate through to market participants in a much more democratized fashion, which was not possible in the traditional model of business, where if you had to get access to a market, you need to have the right business relationships and the right business connect. A third thing that platforms do that we understand very well is the idea of aggregation. They take highly fragmented markets and aggregate them. We don't see that happening so much with some of the bigger platforms that we see around us, but think of a platform like Redbus in India. Redbus is a platform that came in and took a highly fragmented bus industry in India, which was run by private players who were not digitized in the past, digitized them for the first time, aggregated them onto one platform, and created amazing efficiencies in a market for the first time. So platforms take completely fragmented markets and aggregate them in entirely new ways as well. This also happened in the US with a platform called OpenTable that aggregated the entire restaurant industry in the US onto one single platform in a very similar fashion. In addition to aggregating, another thing that platforms do is that having aggregated everything together, they also enable market participants to take an informed decision about who they should transact with. And that is where platforms bring in transparency. What platforms do is they help the producers and the consumers understand each other much better. In the past, markets were extremely opaque, And so one of the key decision factors that resulted in market interactions was the price of a commodity. This worked really well for commodity markets, but it did not work well for markets where the services or the products were highly specialized. What platforms do is that they make all of these market decisions dependent on many more variables that they open out to the various participants in the market. A good example of that is what TripAdvisor did to the hotel industry. In the past, it would be easy to stay with the Marriott or the Hilton. It would be very difficult to stay with, to take a decision about staying at a B&B that you did not know anything about. But today, TripAdvisor creates that transparency that helps you determine whether you should be staying at a certain place, and depending on how well it is rated, you can determine what kind of price you're willing to pay for that place. And that's what a platform like TripAdvisor does. It does not necessarily aggregate the market, it does not unlock spare capacity, but it creates transparency in a way that allows everyone to take better decisions. And a final way in which platforms impact markets, and a very compelling way in which platforms impact markets, is that platforms create intelligence that make not just the market more efficient, but they also create intelligence that teaches the market participants how to participate in the market even better. If you've used any of these platforms, and if you've at any point in time received a notification or an email about a certain set of steps that you could do to increase your visibility on the platform, that's a way of the platform communicating intelligence back to the market. And in the same way, platforms become more intelligent as they are used, and that allows them to connect users in the future much better. Think of the Facebook news feed. The Facebook news feed encapsulates the intelligence that Facebook has as a platform. It knows who you are as a user, and it knows all the information about the content that is available from your network and how that content has been used by other users. Using all of this information, it determines what is the best content to be shown to you. And that is one way where Facebook, as the Facebook news feed, is using intelligence to show you content in a way that a traditional media company never did in the past. And so these are specific ways, by creating scalable gatekeeping, by unlocking spare capacity, by enabling aggregation, by creating transparency in the market, and by using a new kind of intelligence, that platforms impact market structures considerably in this age when platforms are coming in and intermediating markets entirely. And that leads us to the next part of the idea, which is what's special about platforms, what are the key components of a platform business model that enable this market of participants to participate on top of the platform. I think of a platform business model as having 4 key components, and I think of these as the 4 C's. The first key component of a platform business model is that there should be a mechanism for creation, because you have producers and consumers coming on the platform and interacting with each other. So the platform should determine a mechanism by which producers can create on the platform. That involves not just digitally creating something on the platform, it may also involve enabling producers to have the power in the real world to create on the platform. And that is why Uber is taking a lot of steps to enable drivers to get the financing needed that they need to set up a car. In the same way, Airbnb helps to go and take pictures of an apartment so that it helps the person leasing out the apartment to show their apartment in a much better fashion. And so there's a whole range of mechanisms by which platforms enable creators to create for the first time and come onto the platform. So one of the first things when you're thinking of building a platform business model is to ask yourself, how do I enable participants on the platform to create in a manner that is much easier than how they used to create in the past? The second thing is that once you open out the ability to create, it's also important to ensure that you do not end up with too much quantity, but you balance it out with quality. And that's where curation becomes a really important second aspect of the platform business model. Curation is a combination of access control, which is who should get access to the platform and who should not. And it is a combination of that with quality control. What is good quality versus what is not good quality? Curation can happen at many different stages. It can happen at the point at which somebody comes onto the platform. So if you think of a media company like Huffington Post, it's opening itself out as a platform, but it curates heavily at the point of access. It does a lot of access control at the point of access. If you think of another platform like Wikipedia, it allows anybody to come on board, but it curates at the point of creation. You can create certain things, but you cannot take certain actions until you've got a level of reputation on the platform. There are other platforms that curate further down as well. So curation is something that's really important, and it's something that can completely kill a platform even after it has millions of users if the curation is not done well. A third part of the platform business model is the idea of customization. Customization is really important because when you allow people to create value on top of the platform, and when you figure out what is good value and what is not good value, the next question that you need to ask yourself is, what is relevant? We created something, we put a quality aspect to it, how can we now make it relevant? And relevance is what is possible because of customization. Think of what the Facebook newsfeed does again. It customizes exactly what you should be seeing. It looks at what kind of things you've seen in the past, and on the basis of that, it shows you exactly what you should be seeing given your previous history of browsing on Facebook. And that's a way of customizing your experience on top of the platform. So the third thing that's really important is building for relevance and customizing on the platform. And the fourth thing is the idea of consumption, which is that once you've got all of this additional value created on the platform, there should be a mechanism by which people can consume and then pass back a feedback to the creators so that the creators can come and produce more often in the future. So when you have a consumer rating something as good versus bad, it's not just helping the platform in curating and quality control, it's also helping the platform make the creator come back and be more encouraged to participate on the platform in the future. And so these are the four key components of a platform business model: creation, curation, customization, and consumption. I want to end this on a final note, which is when we talk about platforms, we are not just talking about platform business models. What we are also talking about fundamentally, and at this point, this is the point that can get a bit scary, is that we're talking about companies that are amassing a lot of power because of the platform business model. And this is where the quote from Spider-Man facetiously comes to mind: with great power comes great responsibility. But what's happening today is that a lot of platforms, companies, are behaving like it's the Wild West. They're getting a lot of power because of all of these things that we just talked about, but they're not necessarily using that power very responsibly. So when we talk about platforms, what's important is that, yes, we get excited about the idea that there is open production, and so there is very highly scalable value creation that's happening. But what we also need to address is the fact that despite the high value creation and the open production, the problem remains that today's platforms continue to be centrally governed, continue to have centralized motives, and very often what's good for the platform is bad for the ecosystem. In fact, I can demonstrate in 6 different ways what's good for the platform is almost always bad for the ecosystem. And so if we want to really harness this platform revolution well, if we want to benefit from the platform revolution well, and if we want to become a sustainable platform, it's important for us to not just benefit from the business model, but also figure out a model of governance that works for the benefit of the ecosystem. There are many different ways in which this is happening today. Openness, for example, is about how open a platform is. A lot of people do not like closed platforms, which is understandable. But openness today is seen as an ideological debate, whereas actually it's a business question. Today, the way companies think about openness is actually less a question of what should be open and more the question of what should be controlled. If you think of how Android came into existence, when Android started, it started as a completely open platform. Anybody could come in, do anything with Android, create their own version, and put things out. And what happened was Amazon and Samsung came in, they forked Android in different directions, and Android realized it did not have control over the ecosystem. And so Android came in and changed its openness so that it now controlled critical services like maps. Without maps, a mobile phone is useless, and it controlled the user data, and it called that Google Play. And so to gain control over the ecosystem, the platform had to get control back by closing the platform a bit further. So what's important is that a lot of platforms today, when they talk about openness, they're really looking at ways in which they can close the platform so that they can control the key critical points of ownership on the platform. The second thing, where what's good for the platform is bad for the ecosystem, is the idea of interoperability. Today, a lot of platforms work in ways that are not interoperable. A great example of that is what's happening in healthcare today. If you want to solve a patient's problem, you need to provide him everything that helps him solve the disease and to cure the disease. And no single company today has everything that is needed to cure the disease for the particular patient. And so the best way of doing healthcare would be to allow the patient to own the data, make that data interoperable across all platforms, and allow the patient to move easily from one platform to the other. But interoperability comes in the way of a platform's profit, because the fact that a platform is not interoperable is what creates lock-in for the consumer with the platform. So if my data remains with the hospital, it's in the best benefit of the hospital because I stay logged in with the hospital. When I go to a new hospital, I cannot take that data with me, and that prevents me from moving to a new hospital. So what's good for the ecosystem, interoperability, is actually bad for the platform. And that's another thing that we need to think about, especially when we try to build platforms in industries where the greater good is sometimes much more important than just the profit motive that the company has. Healthcare being a great example of that. A third thing that we need to think about carefully is the idea of manipulation. A lot of platforms have data in a way that can be used to manipulate the ecosystem. We have the famous case of Facebook and how Facebook tried a little experiment that made people sadder because they chose to show certain things that would make them sad, and that helped them find out the way people would get influenced by what Facebook showed them. In a similar way, there are ways in which Uber manipulates the market not yet in a or so they claim, not yet in a negative way, but one of the key aspects of the research was that when somebody's mobile phone, the battery of the mobile phone is dying out, those people are more likely to accept a 9 to 10 times surge in price than those who have still some battery left in their mobile phone. And that's a great data point if they really wanted to manipulate the market. So one important thing to think about is that when a platform understands so much data about the market, it gets a lot of power that can potentially be used to manipulate the market towards its own purpose as well. And that's something that, again, needs to be governed in a much more serious and specific fashion in the future. Another issue is the idea of trust. We think of trust between participants on the platform, but more importantly, it's also important to understand trust in the context of how producers on the platform trust the platform. There's a research done at Harvard Business School which lays out how Amazon keeps looking at data about different merchants selling goods on the platform, and it looks for items that are selling really well that work with Amazon's single-day delivery. And very often what Amazon does is it goes ahead, acquires these production facilities, and then starts putting out its own products on the platform, which over time edges out these merchants slowly away from the platform. So that's an example where it's very difficult for some of these merchants to trust the platform, but because of the power that the platform has, it's able to do some of these things at this point in time. One other thing is the idea of neutrality. Platforms should be neutral in a way that they do not side with certain participants and that they do not give certain participants too much power. One of the key issues that's happening out here in the EU right now is that Google is facing a whole series of lawsuits because it's seen as not being a neutral platform, where very often Google gives higher placement to its own services than to the services of competitors. For the platform to really create value in a market and to ensure that the ecosystem gets the most value, it should do it in a way that it stays neutral to all interactions that happen on the ecosystem. And the final thing that I want to talk about briefly is that platforms today can be used to solve a whole range of problems. We looked at some of the examples in the previous presentation about how the refugee crisis could be solved using platforms, how a whole range of social problems could be solved using platforms. But at this point in time, most successful platform implementations have come out of the stable of venture capital. And all these platforms, at the end of the day, are measured not on the basis of any other metric, but on the basis of return on investment. What's the amount that we've invested in the platform and how much can we get out of it? What kind of an IPO can we take it to? And this is where the big question comes up that yes, platforms as a business model can create a lot of value, but will we find financing schemes and will we find governance mechanisms that will ensure that platforms are actually used to solve the world's biggest problems, to solve problems where people who need resources the most are connected with the resources that they need? And that question about impact remains unanswered because today, most of the platforms that we see are still not working on that particular model. Thank you so much for listening. My goal with this was to look at the good side of how platforms are changing the world, but also caution us about the various ways in which the whole story can actually go bad over the next few years if it's not governed and regulated in the right way. Thank you very much.